There are certain names in black music that never get splashed across scandal headlines. Yet, behind the velvet curtains of 1,980 Seconds and 1,990 Seconds Black Showbiz, there was one rule everybody knew by heart. Do not cross Teddy Pendergrass. Not even with a stray glance in the wrong direction, Patti LaBelle had seen it unfold more than once. One throwaway joke, one light touch after a backstage prayer, one careless whisper shared between dancers in the hallway. That was all it took for Teddy to walk off, refuse to sing, and have someone quietly erased from the lineup before the next night's show. According to Patti, who stayed close to Teddy through most of the 80 seconds, there were 6 gay artists in particular who angered him so deeply that he never forgave any of them. Who were they really? What did they say, or what line did they cross, that made Teddy strike their names from his world? Some of them would slowly vanish from the stage, as if swallowed by the dark. Let's start with the first name on that list. And when you hear it, you might not believe what your ears are telling you. There was one thing the black music scene of 1,980 Seconds America quietly murmured about, but almost never dared to speak openly. A long, drawn-out, almost cursed sort of tension between two men, once seen as the beating heart of R&B. One of them was a blazing sex symbol, singing like he was demanding love through sheer physical force. The other drifted in the half-shadows, soft-spoken, sorrowful, always masking his loneliness behind tailored suits and immaculate arrangements. Those two men were Teddy Pendergrass and Luther Vandross. Two worlds that, according to many insiders, were never meant to blend. And on one night in June 1987, inside a narrow elevator at the Apollo Theater, those two worlds almost collided in bare knuckles. On June 15th, under the flickering lights of Harlem, hundreds of artists and devoted fans filled the Apollo to honor Marvin Gaye. The building was soaked in flowers, perfume, tears, and the slow ache of soul music. But after the lights dimmed, the cameras shut down, and the crowd drifted out into the New York night. Something happened between Luther and Teddy that never made it into any official documentary. It existed only in whispers from insiders and from those who had stayed around long enough to see too much. Since the late 1,970 Seconds, Luther Vandross had risen above the crowd with his refined tenor and the uncanny ability to move people's emotions, like an invisible conductor standing in the dark. Yet he was never quite a man of the real world that black male stars were expected to embody. The world that demanded they be visibly strong, obviously straight, preferably married, and always framed by women on their arms. Luther led a life with almost no public love scandals, no paparazzi-ready girlfriends, no red carpet appearances holding a woman's hand. That quietness only poured gasoline on the rumors. Backstage stories circulated that Luther had once, according to reports, paid to hush a same-sex harassment complaint filed by a young assistant in Los Angeles in 1982. A former bandmate claimed Luther had a long, complicated relationship with a male member of the Dramatics. Many in the industry insisted he was drawn to powerful, dominant black men, men who radiated strength. The name that surfaced most often in those late-night conversations was Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy, with his muscular build, raw, raspy voice, and unshakable physical presence, was described as Luther's unreachable fantasy. One former production assistant from the 1985 Atlantic tour recalled that Luther had a habit of watching Teddy a little too intently, for a little too long, making some members of the team uneasy. According to that assistant, there was one night backstage after a show when Teddy stepped out of his dressing room wearing nothing but a towel. Luther was said to have stared so hard and so long that someone had to gently pull him aside. To that witness, it no longer felt like admiration, it felt like fixation. Around the same time, Atlantic Records had quietly floated the idea of a duet project, an album pairing Luther and Teddy, a modern-day echo of Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. But that plan died almost as quickly as it was suggested. Insiders said Teddy shot it down immediately. "I don't record with people like that." Those words reportedly spread through the label's offices like a blade of ice. From then on, the two men carefully avoided each other. No shared stages, no joint photos, not even an accidental smile in the same frame. Yet the unresolved tension stayed there, like a wound under a perfectly pressed suit. On the night of June 15, 1987, after the Marvin Gaye tribute wrapped up at the Apollo, Luther and Teddy ended up in the same cramped elevator with 3 other people. The space was tight, the air thick, heavy with sweat, cologne, and the particular scent of Teddy's leather jacket filling the small box. According to one person who later described the scene, Luther made a quiet remark about Teddy's scent and a night in Paris, half poetic, half playful. The words sounded harmless on the surface, but they were like a lit match tossed into a room full of gasoline fumes that had been building up for years. Teddy said nothing. He just stood there, eyes narrowing, sharp as polished steel. When the elevator doors slid open, Teddy stepped out first. Then, in an instant, he spun around, arm raised, lunging straight toward Luther. If Patti LaBelle hadn't grabbed his arm in that split second, Luther might have taken a fist square to his face right there in the hallway of a tribute meant to honor Marvin Gaye. Everyone who saw it later said Teddy's eyes did not show simple anger. They were filled with something colder, a look of disgust, as if he were staring at something unclean. There was no apology, no private meeting arranged afterward. Luther left early that night. Witnesses said he sat alone in his car for nearly half an hour. No radio, no conversation. Just staring into the darkness through the windshield, as if trying to swallow something he could never name out loud. Years later, when someone asked him in an interview why he had never done a duet with Teddy, Luther simply smiled and gave a vague reply. "Some people," he said softly, "just being near them can burn you up." From 1990 onward, Luther almost completely withdrew from any event where Teddy might appear. His silence became a shield, his distance a quiet defense. But according to singer Fonzie Thornton, a longtime close friend, Luther never fully healed from that moment. The look of contempt, the almost thrown punch, the public rejection, all of it layered on top of a music world where softer men like him were never allowed to exist openly, never allowed to be fully themselves. Luther Vandross died in 2005. No wife, no children, no publicly acknowledged partner. He left behind millions of tender love songs for a world that played them at weddings, anniversaries, and lonely midnights. A world that, in many ways, he was believed never to have truly belonged to. On a misty morning, April 5, 1983, the West Angeles Church of God in Christ in south-central Los Angeles was ringed with black limousines and mourners dressed in somber black and gray. Inside, the sanctuary was thick with grief. Famous faces from the black music world hid behind oversized sunglasses and practiced tight expressions, trying to keep control. Marvin Gaye had been shot dead by his own father just 3 days earlier, and this gathering was considered by many to be the unofficial national memorial for the soul of soul music. Choirs sang, pastors prayed, tributes rolled out one after another. Yet, in the middle of the hymns and the holy words about mercy, there was a single moment as cold as a blade dragging through the sanctified air. A moment no camera captured, no reporter wrote down, but one that carved itself into the memories of anyone close enough to see. The moment Teddy Pendergrass refused to take Billy Preston's hand. By then, Billy Preston was no anonymous musician. He had already written and played with giants. He had sat at the keyboard for both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the only black man in the room when Let It Be was recorded. People called him the fifth Beatle, a Hammond B3 genius, a Grammy winner in 1973. On paper, his resume looked like something carved in gold, but that shining career carried shadows that never truly faded. In 1977, Billy was arrested at a Venice Beach motel for disturbing the peace. Leaked police documents later were said to reveal that he had been caught in a sexual situation with a teenage male. The case never exploded in the mainstream press, but inside the industry, people talked. That was why, after 1980, Billy's appearances shifted. He seemed to show up mainly at religious programs, charity events, and quieter music projects work that kept him present, but no longer in the center of the spotlight. Teddy Pendergrass was one of the few major artists who still crossed paths with him during those years. The two had shared a stage at an NAACP charity show in Atlanta in 1981, but there was never any sign of closeness. Behind the scenes, Teddy kept a careful distance, never sitting too near, never seeking conversation, always instructing his team to preserve a buffer of personal space. According to one crew member from that period, there was a party after an event where Billy, a bit drunk, pointed toward Teddy and joked, "That gospel boy is the only one I'd pay to touch." The comment froze the room. On the surface, it sounded like a throwaway line, but in that environment, aimed at a man already carrying the weight of a hypermasculine image, it felt more like a challenge than a joke. The story went unspoken afterward, but from that night on, Teddy's distance from Billy hardened into something like a wall. To Teddy, it wasn't just crude, it was sacrilege. The Marvin Gaye memorial service began at 10 a.m., under the white dome of West Angeles. Marvin's casket lay at the center, like an offering. Older legends, Smokey Robinson, Gladys Knight, Dionne Warwick, sat near the front, in heavy silence. Billy arrived late. His afro, streaked with gray, framed a face that looked tired, worn down. His long black robe made him seem more like an exhausted preacher than the once electrifying sideman to the biggest bands in the world. He took a spot toward the back, speaking to almost no one, bowing his head during the prayers. But when the final hymn ended and people began filing out, hugging and murmuring condolences, Billy made a decision. He broke away from the drifting crowd and walked straight toward Teddy. He slipped through clusters of mourners until he was standing right in front of him. Then he extended his hand, palm open, as if making a small offering. His voice, deep and a little hoarse from emotion, trembled as he spoke. "You know," he said, "your voice is the only thing that makes me believe angels can dwell in men." The conversations around them died instantly. People turned and watched. Teddy looked down at the outstretched hand. He said nothing. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a tissue, and without touching, Billy began to wipe his own hand in full view of everyone standing nearby. Each movement was deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if he were cleaning off something contaminated. Then he turned his back and walked away, leaving Billy standing alone just outside the church doors. Billy's hand stayed extended for a moment longer, then fell slowly to his side. His face barely changed, no outburst, no protest, but his eyes darkened as if someone had poured ash into them. No one moved toward him. No one laughed to break the tension. No one stepped in to soften what had just happened. That rejection, simple, silent, wordless, was heavier than a slap, more brutal than a punch thrown in anger. After the service, Billy walked out by himself. A security guard later claimed he saw Billy sitting in his car for a long time before he finally turned the key. According to that guard, the man once called a genius sat there and wept quietly, tears falling onto his robe, with no audience, no comfort, no witness, except the steering wheel and the windshield. No one asked him if he was all right. No one followed him to the parking lot. Teddy never publicly discussed that day, but in a 1985 interview, when he was asked about artists he felt were spiritually out of sync with him, he gave a cold, cryptic answer. "Some people call my voice angelic," he said, "but they don't understand that angels can be angry too." He didn't mention any names. But for those who had watched the drama unfold at the memorial, the meaning felt clear enough. Whatever Teddy felt toward Billy, it didn't come from envy. It came from something deeper and darker, the humiliation of being openly desired by a man with a deeply controversial reputation in a sacred space where everything was supposed to be about grief, faith, and forgiveness. For Teddy, Billy's outstretched hand wasn't simply a condolence. It was, in his eyes, an offense, a man shadowed by allegations from the past, daring to call him a vessel for angels in front of everyone. Billy Preston lived on for years afterward, taking small performance gigs, appearing on gospel TV, and checking in and out of rehab centers. He died in 2006 from complications related to high blood pressure and kidney failure, leaving an enormous catalog of music that still influenced players across generations, yet always slightly clouded by a past that few wanted to drag into the light. For those who had been in that church in 1983, the refused handshake became more than a private humiliation. It was a kind of verdict. From that day forward, among certain circles, no one dared to call Teddy Pendergrass an angel again. Jermaine Stewart walked into the 1,980 seconds with a strange kind of manifesto. "We don't have to take our clothes off to have a good time." A lyric that sounded playful and innocent on the surface, but carried a quiet sadness that only people living on the margins could fully recognize. In an R&B landscape overflowing with testosterone and hard-edged masculinity, Jermaine looked like he had come from another planet. He wore chiffon, let his hair fall long, brushed on soft makeup, and danced with a fluidity that blurred the line between masculine and feminine until it almost disappeared. He never publicly labeled himself as gay, but men who said they had shared apartments with him in London, whispers about secret late-night dance auditions, and the way he was known to stare a little too long at certain bodies backstage all fed the same rumor mill. In the black music world of the 80 Seconds, Jermaine became one of the most quietly talked-about figures. What very few people outside the inner circle knew was that, in the early part of that decade, Jermaine and Teddy Pendergrass were briefly under the same management umbrella. At that point, Jermaine was still just a backup dancer for Shalimar, while Teddy had already claimed the throne as the new king of modern soul. No one remembered any meaningful conversations between them. But one former employee said Jermaine often asked detailed questions about Teddy, his habits, his routines, the way he spoke, the way he walked on and off stage. It didn't feel like simple admiration, that employee recalled. It felt as if Jermaine were trying to write a screenplay in his mind, with Teddy in the lead role. And eventually, he did. On the night of July 16th, 1988, New York hosted the Studio 54 Revival Party, an event staged like a resurrection of the old disco temple. Drag queens, bisexual performers, queer artists, and underground figures surged through the club like a tidal wave. The energy was wild, defiant, and unapologetic. In the middle of that feverish night, one surprise act froze the room. A drag queen named Luscious Simone stepped onto the stage, styled as a Teddy Pendergrass double black leather jacket, gloves, sunglasses, the same confident stance. She grabbed the microphone, opened a notebook, and began to read. It wasn't a speech about Marvin Gaye, as some in the audience expected. It wasn't a typical campy monologue. It was a piece of erotic fanfiction written in the first person, a story that insiders said Jermaine Stewart himself had written and shared among friends as a private joke. That night, somebody had decided the joke needed an audience. The story described Jermaine and Teddy stuck in a hotel elevator in Chicago in 1983, the air thick with heat and sweat, their breathing getting heavy, tension turning into bickering, then into charged silence, then into a sudden kiss that spiraled into something far more explicit. Luscious read the lines in a sultry voice, leaning into every pause. The crowd roared with laughter. Some artists clapped and cheered at the boldness, others shifted uncomfortably. A few people quietly pulled out their phones or audio recorders, capturing fragments of the performance. By the next morning, those recordings had already found their way to Teddy's assistant. When the tape was played back at Teddy's management office in Philadelphia, the mood in the room reportedly went dead cold. One staff member remembered a specific moment, when the line came, "As his hand moved down to my waist." Teddy set his glass down, stood up, and walked out without saying a word. For 12 long minutes, the office sat in silence, the tape still, and everyone waiting. Then Teddy came back, his jaw tight, his tone controlled, but clenched. "I don't accept my name being dragged into that kind of garbage," he declared. From there, his instructions were clear and immediate. Contact the organizers, send formal letters. Demand that the entire performance be pulled from any future program and that any use of his name, image, or implied likeness in such material be banned. For Teddy, this wasn't entertainment. It was an attack. A man who had once shared the same management, who had reportedly been removed from a charity recording lineup for not being mainstream enough, had now turned him into a character in an erotic fantasy on stage in New York in front of a cheering crowd. The line between imagination and disrespect had been crossed. To Teddy, this wasn't fan expression anymore. It was violation, and violation demanded consequences. The event organizers apologized quickly. Luscious Simone was banned from the following nights of the revival. As for Jermaine, he stayed silent. No formal comment, no public statement. He vanished from the media for about 3 weeks. When he finally resurfaced during a Brooklyn radio interview, a host asked him directly if he had written the fanfiction behind the performance. Jermaine just laughed. "I don't write fanfiction," he said, "but if anyone thinks I'd want to be stuck in an elevator with Teddy Pendergrass, at least my taste is fire." It was half a joke, half a dare. And it became the final straw. From that moment on, Teddy severed every tie with Jermaine. He turned down BET events the moment Jermaine's name appeared on the program. He refused to participate in a Quincy Jones tribute show in 1989 simply because Jermaine was slated to be part of the dance crew. In Teddy's eyes, Jermaine was no longer just a flamboyant artist. He had become a blasphemer, someone who toyed with the fragile idea of black manhood in a world that barely allowed gay men to exist without scorn. A man who had taken Teddy's name and body and turned them into a prop in a sexual story, even if only for one night. Jermaine, who had once touched the charts with "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off," began to fall hard. His next album stiffened on release. U.S. shows were canceled in clusters. He retreated to European markets, focusing on Germany, then moved quietly to Switzerland, living almost in hiding. By 1993, whispers of an HIV diagnosis began to circulate. Jermaine neither confirmed nor denied anything. He simply kept moving, smaller and smaller, show by show. In 1997, Jermaine Stewart died in Homewood, Illinois, at the age of 39, in a nursing facility for AIDS patients. Time smudged his legacy. Fewer people remembered him as a defining funk-pop voice. Instead, inside certain circles, he became the man who wrote the wrong story. A private tale meant to get a laugh among friends had turned into a weapon cutting through the thin, fragile line separating fantasy from dignity. And for Teddy Pendergrass, the man who had been turned into a character in that story, there was no forgiveness. A person who dared to drag his name into a sexual narrative without his consent would never, in Teddy's mind, have a place in the real world he fought to control. Sometimes a single offhand comment whispered backstage can shatter any hope of a future collaboration, especially when that comment comes from a dancer in a white pop star's crew, aimed directly at a black sex symbol like Teddy Pendergrass, especially when the subject is sex. And especially when the name being dropped is George Michael. In October 1989, Atlanta sat under the dry, brittle chill of late fall. But inside the Fox Theater, the air felt like it was boiling. It was the night of the BET Soul Awards, a celebration of the year's most powerful black artists. On stage, names like Patti LaBelle, Whitney Houston, and New Edition owned the spotlight, their voices shaking the rafters. Backstage, though, in a quiet corner behind heavy curtains and stage equipment, another kind of tension was forming. It was invisible, unannounced, but very real. A collision between two worlds that, on paper, were never meant to intersect: George Michael and Teddy Pendergrass. George, just past 30, was riding the peak of international fame after the massive success of Faith in 1987. The image of him swaying in a leather jacket, singing "I Want Your Sex" in a sun-bleached desert, had burned itself into the global memory. But behind the glossy music videos and award shows, there was a more complicated story. He was not publicly out as gay, yet his lyrics, glances, and body language were saturated with suppressed desire that many believed leaned heavily toward black men. People never forgot his tender duet with Aretha Franklin on "I Knew You Were Waiting for Me." Interviews where he mentioned Stevie Wonder and Donny Hathaway as childhood idols only deepened the sense that his heart had always been tuned to black soul. According to industry gossip, he often spoke with almost reverent admiration for certain black male singers. Teddy Pendergrass, in that context, was the living embodiment of a forbidden dream. Male, black, sensual to the core, a voice like torn velvet soaked in smoke and heat, radiating dominance with every slow step and every line he sang. For someone like George, Teddy was not just another artist. He represented a fantasy that could never safely exist in public. Ironically, that night at the Soul Awards, both men had been invited not only to perform, but to be honored. George's presence stood out. He was one of the very few white artists at an event dedicated to black musicians. but he had shared a hit with Aretha, and he was reportedly preparing a new project steeped in American soul and funk. By all accounts, he arrived with genuine goodwill and respect. Then, just hours before showtime, a single sentence turned everything toxic. In the makeup area backstage, a young dancer from George's tour, rumored by some to be his unofficial lover, walked over to Teddy. Leaning close, he spoke just loud enough for Teddy to hear. "You know," he said casually, "George says you're the reason he'd never marry a woman." There was no playful grin, no nervously charming laugh, just a flat, almost neutral delivery. But the words dropped like a knife onto Teddy's pride. In one stroke, they reduced him from commanding black icon to the unspoken center of a white man's private fantasy. Teddy didn't respond. He simply turned away, his silence colder than any insult. Then, almost immediately, he made a request to the organizers. The men's dressing rooms had to be separated. In the internal guest list and logistics notes for that year, there was said to be a handwritten line: TP requests a separate room to avoid unnecessary interactions. No one challenged it. No one questioned why. But from that moment, the crew felt the air tighten. Something unspoken had happened, and everyone knew better than to ask. The show began. Outside, the stage blazed with lights and applause. Inside the auditorium, the cameras captured George Michael sitting alone on a stool, performing One More Try, with nothing but a soft keyboard behind him. His voice trembled with vulnerability. The crowd listened. In the VIP section, Teddy sat still, his eyes locked anywhere but the stage. He didn't look up. Those who watched him later said it felt like there was a tall, invisible wall stretching between the two men on one side. A man burning with unspoken longing. On the other, a man wrapped in rigid, defensive silence. After the show, George did what polite professionals are expected to do. With his usual British courtesy, he approached Teddy to greet him. He extended his hand, offered a cordial smile, and began to thank him for coming. Teddy didn't take the hand. He turned his face away, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. "Don't make me angry here." The hallway froze. For a few seconds, no one breathed. George stood there, hand still hanging between them, then slowly pulled it back. No one stepped in to smooth things over. No manager rushed in with a joke. No publicist tried to turn the moment into a harmless misunderstanding. George left early that night. Teddy stayed, but he never mentioned the exchange. He didn't need to. Everyone within earshot understood that a line had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. That seemingly harmless backstage remark from the dancer, a sentence thrown out like a flirtatious compliment, had forced Teddy into the role of someone else's object of desire. In a culture where black masculinity was constantly under a microscope, permanently pressured to be strong, heterosexual, and untouchable, being framed as the private fantasy of a white gay man was not a compliment at all. For Teddy, it was a covert humiliation, a quiet invasion into his sense of manhood and control. Nearly 9 years later, in 1998, George Michael was arrested in a Beverly Hills public restroom on charges of soliciting sex. Cameras flashed, headlines screamed, and he was pushed into publicly acknowledging what many had suspected for years. But in all the media frenzy, no one mentioned Atlanta. No reporter dug up the backstage moment at the BET Soul Awards. No one asked what had happened when one of the world's biggest white pop stars brushed too close to one of black music's most guarded sex symbols. Teddy himself never spoke about that night again. But according to a close industry friend, from the moment they left the Fox Theater, he quietly blacklisted the idea of ever working with George. Producers who floated concepts like a new funk remix of Close the Door with George singing the hook were shut down immediately. The official reason Teddy gave was always the same: spiritually incompatible. The unofficial truth, the one people whispered in green rooms and late-night phone calls, was much simpler. No one wants to be reduced to another person's secret fantasy, especially when that fantasy is delivered in a hushed voice in the most sacred territory of an artist's identity. The backstage, the place where they're supposed to feel safest. For George Michael, that line his dancer repeated might have sounded like a romantic confession. For Teddy Pendergrass, it was a violation he would never forgive. Some scandals never make it into headlines, but they still manage to erase a person's future as surely as any front-page story. In the black music world of the 1980 seconds, where the line between the soul of the music and the dirt of a private life was drawn with something as sharp as a razor. One stray rumor, one wrong glance, or one hug with the wrong person could quietly cut you off every tour poster in the country. David Peaston learned that lesson, but only when it was already too late. David was a rare flame in the American gospel scene in the late 80 seconds. Born in Missouri to a musical family, with his mother, Martha Bass, already known as a respected gospel singer, David carried a tenor voice that could slice straight through a full choir. He wasn't conventionally handsome, and he didn't radiate sexual magnetism. But when he stepped under the stage lights, his whole face lit up. His eyes would shut tight on the high notes, and a chill would move through the room like a slow wave. He won Showtime at the Apollo, was invited to sing with Natalie Cole, and critics praised him as the man who brought raw soul back into gospel at a time when drum machines and synthesizers were starting to drown everything out. But the higher he climbed toward the spotlight, the longer and darker the shadow behind him became. Whispers started in 1988, when David joined the Gospel All-Stars Tour across the southern United States. A dancer later claimed in an interview, one that never made it to broadcast, that he had walked into a dressing area close to midnight and seen David wearing a deep purple velvet robe holding a young lighting technician close. The two men stood forehead to forehead, whispering to each other between speakers that someone had forgotten to turn off. The most unsettling part wasn't the embrace itself, it was the location. The dancer said the moment unfolded in the prayer room, a space reserved only for hymns, Bible reading, and prayers before each performance. No one confronted David about it afterward. No one wrote anything down. But that image followed him from city to city like a shadow that would not let go. In 1989, David received what seemed like a career-defining opportunity. He was invited on the Soul Revival Nights Tour, a high-profile run that blended R&B, gospel, and soul on major stages like the Apollo, the Fox, and the Chicago Theater. For a gospel singer, it was a rare chance to share the bill with heavyweight names like Patti LaBelle, Luther Ingram, and Teddy Pendergrass. But from the first rehearsal, the air between David and Teddy felt icy. Teddy barely looked in David's direction. No shared photos. No warm handshakes after soundcheck. According to one backstage staff member, Teddy gave the organizers a blunt instruction. "Don't make me share a dressing room with that guy." People could guess why, but no one said it out loud. On the night of October 14th, 1989, the tour hit the Chicago Theater, one of its biggest stops. Backstage was overcrowded. Crews had to use portable bathrooms outside as makeshift changing rooms, makeup corners, and resting spots between sets. Around 9:30 p.m., a lighting technician rushed up to Teddy's assistant and whispered in his ear, "David is hugging a sound tech in the blue bathroom." There was no photo, no recording, no hard proof, just a sentence, carried on a nervous breath. It spread through the backstage like a flash fire anyway. For Teddy, it was enough. On the ride back to the hotel, as the van rolled down Michigan Avenue, Teddy sat in the back staring out at the city lights. Then, in a low, freezing tone, he muttered, "I don't preach with people who sneak around in God's room." No one responded. No one dared. The sentence landed, and the decision was made. By the next morning, the poster for the Milwaukee show had been quietly reprinted. David Peaston's name had vanished from the lineup. There was no public announcement, no official explanation. The rehearsal call sheet simply went out without his name. The crew van did not stop at his hotel. When people asked what happened, the tour representative brushed it off as a schedule change. But everyone who had heard the whisper about the blue bathroom knew exactly what that meant. For David, the blow didn't come from an angry audience or a tabloid expose. It came from inside the artist community itself. A black, possibly gay gospel singer, cut from a major tour not because of a police report or a scandal on TV, but because someone claimed he hugged the wrong person in a space considered sacred. No one publicly labeled him. No magazine ran a tell-all piece. Instead, there was a coordinated silence just sharp enough, just long enough for him to fade away without a single official accusation on record. David tried to climb back. In 1991, he released a solo album titled Mixed Emotions, but it struggled to find a large audience. Traditional gospel labels kept their distance, reluctant to sign him to long-term deals. He shifted to touring small churches across the Midwest, took on work as a music teacher, and made a brief appearance in 1994 on a cable TV show. But the bright national stage lights never truly sought him out again. By the late 90s, David's health began to crumble. His weight climbed dangerously. Doctors diagnosed him with severe diabetes. In 2004, the disease forced him to undergo a leg amputation. Years passed in and out of treatment. In 2012, David Peaston died at age 54 inches St. Louis, the city where he had been born, and where only a handful of people still remembered how his voice used to shake a room. There was no grand memorial, no star-studded tribute concert, just a small mention in the back pages of Jet magazine describing him as the gospel singer who had briefly made waves in the late 80s. The hug in the blue bathroom in 1989 was never mentioned, but for those who knew the story, that unseen moment felt like the silent full stop at the end of his career. For Teddy, David was someone who, in his mind, didn't deserve to sing about God if he couldn't keep his private life clean. For David, maybe the only real mistake he ever made was hugging the wrong person in the wrong place while the right people were close enough to hear about it. The most frightening kind of sinner is not always the one who breaks the rules in the open, it is the one who covers everything with sermons and scripture. In Teddy Pendergrass's eyes, Clifton Davis was exactly that kind of man. Clifton Davis was one of the rare figures who straddled both Hollywood soundstages and church pulpits. In the early 1970 seconds, he wrote the timeless hit Never Can Say Goodbye for the Jackson 5 when he was barely in his 20s. Later, he became a familiar television face, playing Reverend Reuben Gregory on the sitcom Amen, which ran from 1986 to 1991. With his carefully combed hair, clear voice, and spotless public image, Clifton fit the mold of the ideal black man on TV, polite, polished, morally upright. But not everyone believed in that polished surface. After he shifted more heavily into ministry, Clifton carried his wholesome persona with him into the church world. He crisscrossed the United States speaking at large conferences, appeared on Christian networks like CBN and Trinity Broadcasting Network, and preached about love, forgiveness, and a life guided by God's will. Yet within the black church community, quiet whispers began to drift from the late 80s onward. A young pastor from Nashville, writing anonymously in a confidential account in 1991, said that one night after a summer seminar, he had been invited to stay and pray privately with Clifton after everyone else had gone home. In a dim room with warm golden lighting, they knelt side by side, their hands touching. According to that pastor, Clifton placed a hand gently on his cheek and whispered a prayer. May God open the path for those who carry hidden burdens. The pastor did not call the moment sexual, but he wrote that he felt as if his soul had been touched in a way he wasn't prepared for. The piece never printed Clifton's name, but those who followed his schedule and appearances believed the details, the city, the event, the time frame lined up a little too closely. From there, similar rumors started to accumulate. A CBN crew member later claimed that Clifton often insisted on private prayer sessions with young men after broadcasts and would specifically request no third parties in the room. A youth group leader from a Baltimore church said he once opened a prayer room door at the wrong moment and saw Clifton holding another man in a close embrace. No formal complaint was filed. No board investigation was launched. But in a culture that demands absolute moral clarity from pastors, those stories were enough for someone like Teddy Pendergrass to feel nothing but disgust. At one point, Teddy was invited to make an appearance on a faith-based TV show hosted by Clifton in 1992. Officially, Teddy's assistant told the producers that his schedule was too crowded. But according to one producer who worked on the show, Teddy had been more blunt in a private conversation. I don't want to share a stage with anyone who uses the Bible to hide what they're afraid to live honestly, he reportedly said. To Teddy, that wasn't a critique. It was a sentence handed down. In April 1993, the Gospel and Brotherhood Seminar in Atlanta brought together about 800 attendees, artists, pastors, choir directors, and church members from across the southeastern states. Clifton Davis was the keynote speaker, the smiling face at the center of the program. During his 20-minute address, he spoke about God's love for those wrestling with private secrets. He never said the word sexuality, but many in the audience believed that was exactly what he meant. Teddy sat in the front row. As soon as Clifton said the phrase, "God understands those who can't speak their truth," Teddy leaned toward Patti LaBelle, tilted his head, and murmured under his breath, "Don't use the Bible to cover up sin." A few people sitting near them heard every word. Patti squeezed Teddy's hand, as if to keep him from reacting more openly.